A young man named Sammy is 18 years old. Sammy is a young man who loves sports. During that period, the fame of the fighter known as Russell Lee was at its peak. And therefore martial arts sports were the dominant sport at that time. Sammy loved to perform strenuous exercise. And therefore Sammy had a graceful, athletic body. Also, at that time, young people were getting married at a slightly early age. Unlike our present day, and therefore Sammy was invited to attend a friend's wedding. The distance between Sammy's house and the place where the wedding will take place was about 7 kilometers. Fortunately for Sammy, there was a car designated for the family that Sammy was going to use in order to attend the wedding. Indeed, Sammy went to the wedding party and sat there until it was over at about 1 o'clock in the morning. Sammy went to his car in order to return home. And here was the problem: the car did not work. Although Sammy tried to make the car start, he was unable to do so. In the end, Sammy decided to go home on foot. In fact, before Sammy moved from his location, he had to think a lot, because the road is bumpy and he will pass through a deserted place with houses. An ancient and most terrifying cemetery abandoned for nearly 120 years, Sammy had no other choice. Sammy walked on his way, and when he reached the old cemetery there were many dogs next to it. Sammy was not afraid of the dogs, but in anticipation of any attack from them he grabbed a large piece of wood that was lying in the road. When Sammy approached the cemetery, he saw something very scary. There was a girl dressed in white sitting on a chair in front of the door of the cemetery. Sammy began to recite some verses of the Quran and decided to walk on his way without looking at the cemetery or at this girl, and sit with me for a while. Sammy was terrified of these words and started running at full speed. Sammy looked behind him and found that this girl was high off the ground and flying towards him at full speed. Sammy did not stop running and continued running until he found a small mosque on the side of the road. Sammy broke the lock of the door of the mosque and entered it and sat behind the door for fear of this girl breaking in. The girl behind the door said, "I will not let you, Sammy. Remember that well." After a few seconds, Sammy heard the voice of a man approaching the door of the mosque. That man was the muezzin. The girl behind the door said, "I will not let you, Sammy. Remember that well." After a few seconds, Sammy heard the voice of a man approaching the door of the mosque. That man was the muezzin. As it was time for the dawn prayer, Sammy calmed down a bit when he learned that it was already the time for the dawn prayer and that the man outside was indeed the muezzin. The muezzin entered the mosque, and when he saw Sammy in a state out of panic and fear, he said to him, "What happened to you, my son? Why do you show signs of terror and fear?" Sammy told the muezzin everything that had happened to him. The muezzin asked Sammy to prepare for the far prayer so that he would not be late for its time, and after the prayer they would go together to Sheikh Muhammad, who was a well-known sheikh in this village. Indeed, Sammy had finished the far prayer and he accompanied by the mosque muezzin, headed to Sheikh Muhammad, while Sammy and the muezzin were walking. The muezzin said, "Sammy, listen, my son, that the genie that appeared to you near the cemetery is a genie known to the villagers here. She is a genie who seduces men in order to enter the cemetery with her. In fact, no man entered the cemetery with her." When Sammy and the muezzin arrived at the house, Sheikh Muhammad was not at home. Sheikh Muhammad returned minutes later and welcomed Sammy and the muezzin. Sammy told Sheikh Muhammad about everything that happened with him. Sheikh Muhammad asked Sammy to commit himself to reading the Quran and praying, as well as paying attention to reading the morning and evening remembrances. Sheikh Muhammad started reciting verses from the Holy Quran on Sammy's body to make sure that he was not subject to touch from this genie. In the end, Sammy returned to his home, and his heart was still filled with fear and terror from the horror of what he saw. Sammy did not tell anyone about what happened to him. Days and months passed, and Sammy forgot what happened to him. He no longer read the Quran regularly as he used to. In addition to that, he abandoned reading the dhikr. On that day, while Sammy was sleeping in his bed, he suddenly woke up to the sound of someone breathing next to him. Sammy woke up and found the fairy in his room, and she looked very frightening and terrifying. Since that day, Sammy disappeared and no longer had any trace of him.